Is language an innate, built-in skill that is coded into the human DNA? Hello, I'm Julian Northbrook, Language Punk, and welcome to another video in the Language Science series. To watch the other videos in this series, just click on the funny little icon thing that appears in the corner. You know the one I mean. One of the most important questions in the field of language science or psycholinguistics is the question of whether or not language is an innate ability. That is, whether or not language is a skill that we are literally born with, one that is encoded in our DNA from birth. In the early 1900s, a theory of skill learning called behaviorism was very, very popular. And at the top of the field was a very famous psychologist called Burrhus Frederick Skinner, who wrote this book, Verbal Behavior. Verbal behavior argued that language is not an innate ability, something coded into the DNA, but rather is simply a habit, just like any other skill that human beings may learn. And then one day, along came Noam Chomsky, whose review of verbal behavior decimated Skinner's ideas, and thus began a whole new age in the field of language science or psycholinguistics that lasted from about the 1950s until fairly recently. Human beings, Chomsky argued, would simply be unable to master a language based on the input that they receive. This input is far too impoverished, he argued, and we would not be able to extract the complex regularities and patterns of the language simply from that impoverished input. Therefore, Chomsky concluded that the skill that is language must already be encoded in the human DNA. From that point, Skinner faded into the background and language became to be seen as primarily a grammatical system that was already embedded in the human genes, something with parameters that would be activated upon exposure to a language. Depending on the language you were exposed to as a child, parameters would be set in different ways to result in your language. This sounds complicated, but really it's not. You can think of it as being like baking a cake. A cake is a cake is a cake, but you can put chocolate into a cake to make a chocolate cake, or you can put carrot into a cake and make a carrot cake. They're both cakes, they're just different kinds of cakes. But importantly for generative grammar and Chomsky's theory of innate language ability, although we have different languages, French is different to English, which is different to Japanese, all languages share the same universal principles. That is, just like the base of a cake is exactly the same no matter what kind of cake you try to make, the basic underlying system that makes up a language is the same, Chomsky argued, across all languages. This is important because it is this universal system that Chomsky argued makes language language, and this is exactly what he said must be encoded in the human DNA. If we didn't have this, surely all languages would be very, very, very different and they wouldn't share these underlying systematic similarities. This viewpoint of language dominated the field of language science for decades, for about 50 years in fact. And it wasn't until quite recently when, thanks to technology, we were able to develop new research methods that, guess what? We realized that good old Skinner was probably right. Language probably is just a habit. You see, the main argument for generative grammar and innate language ability was always what Chomsky called the poverty of the stimulus. That is, the input is too impoverished to be able to extract the extremely complex patterns of a language. However, modern research technology tells us actually, yes, we can extract the statistical probability needed to produce language as complex and rich as what we do from the input that we receive. This is what we call a usage-based approach to language development. And we have usage-based theories of first language development and second language development. And this is exactly what I do in my research. I have to say that the argument about whether Chomsky was right in language is an innate ability or whether language is simply a habit is still a hotly debated topic. The argument still rages on. I am from the usage-based school of psycholinguistics, language study, whatever you want to call it. And I am very, very much on the language is usage-based. It is habitual, not innate side of the argument. The topic of what exactly usage-based theories of language development entail is something which I think I will come to in a future video because this one is getting long. But before I go, I will tell you this. If you are learning a language, then you had better hope that we on the usage-based side of the fence are right and not the guys on the innate ability side of the fence. Because if you take the view that language is something we are born with, well, that makes the question of whether you are ever able to learn a language properly or not very, very tricky. And clearly we know that you can learn second languages because people do it every single day. How do they do it? That is the topic of my book, Master English Fast. And although I don't ever use the term usage-based theory in this book, because hey, it's written for the lay reader, many of the exercises and techniques and ideas of language learning that I talk about in here are very much based on my own research and the research that I follow in the field of usage-based theories of second language development, particularly something which I call example-based learning, which I go into immense detail about in my book. To pick up a copy of this bad boy or to read the first chapter for free, just head over to masterenglishfast.com. That's the end of today's video, but before I go, what do you think? Intuitively, do you believe that language is something which we are born with, something that is encoded in our DNA, or do you believe that language is simply a habit like any other skill? Tell us all about it in the comments. I'm looking forward to hearing what you've got to say. Thank you and goodbye.